Now. I realised that I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. I'm Andrew Shepherd. Claire Melamed, my colleague, was supposed to chair today, but she was unable to. So I've stepped in, and I'm director of the Chronic Poverty Research Centre and a research fellow here at ODI. Now, when you make your contributions, if you could say who you are. If you have an institutional affiliation, please tell us your institutional affiliation. And make your contribution fairly briefly. I mean, the room is quite full. We've got people online. So whether it's a question or a comment, please be brief. If it's a question, maybe direct your question to one of the speakers, or say say who it's directed to anyway, or it may be a question for the audience.
Or for the chair.
Or for the chair, I suppose, if you insist. Yes. I'd just while you're assembling your thoughts, I've got a few questions which, in a sense, are partly also to provoke you, but some of the speakers may want to reflect back on this. We've heard talk about the process going forwards. We haven't heard very much about the politics of that process. And I think it's quite important that we reflect on the politics. So, yes, we need leadership. So where is that leadership going to come from? Who are the potential leaders? And what is the politics behind getting their points of view across and accepted, and getting the kind of dynamic, visionary process that the speakers have referred to? The world is a changing place, and there are new actors coming in as potential candidates. For example, what is the implication of the rise of China and India in this particular, and South Africa, in this particular process? You would have thought that there would be some significant implications, the G20 and so on. Secondly, the world, in terms of getting to an agreement, a good North-South partnership, North-South agreement, the world has not got a very good record in the last 10 years. If we think about climate change negotiations, if we think about trade negotiations. So there are, and I think this relates to some of the comments which have been made already about moving to a binding agreement and accountability and so on. It can be quite hard in that messy process that you describe to get to that point. And I'm wondering about the politics of some of the suggestions that, or the aspirations that you've made. And yes, sometimes you do come down to an agreement which is the lowest common denominator agreement, rather than that kind of more visionary agreement. So how can we avoid that lowest common, well, how can we avoid the threat scenario that you pointed out, and how can we avoid that kind of lowest common denominator? A little question about rights, because the rights approach does give you the basis for the kind of vision that you're talking about, Mukesh. And many in civil society organizations would, as you suggested, want to be signing up behind a rights-based approach. Some middle-income countries are moving in that direction, legislating for specific rights. South Africa is an example, India would be another example, Latin American countries also. Low-income countries are pretty reluctant. Governments are pretty reluctant to go down that route. Donor countries are often quite reluctant also, although there are often significant factions within donor agencies charged with international development who like the rights approach, but there can be a political reluctance there. So let's think about the politics of that. Okay, so those are just a few provocative, hopefully additional provocative points. Who'd like to start? And we'll have a roving microphone. We'll maybe start from one side of the room and move to the other, or we'll start at the back and move to the front. What about that?
Hi, my name is Beverly Hall, and I'm from a trade union called Prospect, a union for professionals here based in the UK. I suppose as a trade unionist, my questions are always based on the rights approach, and I suppose it's open to the panel because there was very little mention of, number one, the role of the private sector in this new agenda, because we see there's, globally a huge move to get them involved in development. And then secondly, obviously, the role of the trade unions in that world of work, and obviously the growing world of the working poor in the developing world. And I'd just be interested to know your thoughts on how those aspects would be integrated into a new vision.
Okay, anybody else? Nick.
We have a question from online. Cassie Williams from Women and Children First asks, how do we get governments in the developing world to firstly fully engage and secondly to represent their poorest and most vulnerable? And we also have someone who seconded your question, and in fact asked it before you asked it. So you.
Oh, sorry about that. Which one was that?
On global governance and what's the sort of next steps in in terms of getting movement on the global governance.
It's important that we come back to that in that case. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Yes, Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Wafer from DFID. Quite a few people in the post-2015 discussions have started to say, and I think Mukesh, you're alluding to this as well, this needs to be a framework for the world, not just for low-income countries. We can't really divide the world into that sort of dichotomy anymore. Middle-income countries have thrown this up in the last 10 years. I'm conscious that we're sitting in ODI with a panel of people who work for development agencies that work in the South. Probably most people in the audience work in the development business. If we're serious about a framework which is actually supposed to be for the citizens of the world, when are we going to start the conversations, and how are we going to start the conversations so that this resonates for people beyond the bottom billion?
Very good, thank you. Yes, I think, yeah.
Hi, my question relates, sorry, I'm Sailesh Katari. I work with RICS Disaster Management Commission. Partly it links to Amy's thing, one specific thing where you mentioned your 100 voices linked to the ownership needs to be at the national government level. And I understand the sentiment behind it, but at the same time, working on Hyogo framework and risk reduction related issues, one of the key issues has been that, yes, at policy level, even at national level, things have moved forward, but nonetheless, on the coalface, at the local level, there hasn't been as much of a progress. And I just wonder if that issue was tackled in your study, or if those voices linked to things related to that. And a second question, if I'm allowed, which is linked to, again, right now we're struggling with issues related to climate change adaptation, risk reduction, resilience, different agendas, trying to either harmonize, bring them closer together, etc. In the 12 points which Mukesh mentioned, risk reduction, resilience-related issues clearly are within that. And yes, we are also in post-Hyogo time frame, which is 2015. And again, I work with Bond Disaster Reduction Group as well. And the key issues we are trying to indicate is that, yes, the lack of resilience, risk reduction related goals in the MDGs has meant that there has been less progress on that, having a separate framework, and what might be the views on how those get integrated, especially with the kind of political issues where you mentioned, where would UNISDR be promoting the same thing, or would they be promoting slightly different issues linked to their mandates and rest of it? That's it.
Thank you very much. I think let's pause there, because there are quite a lot of quite substantial issues there for us to get our teeth into. And we'll come back for another round, and possibly even a third round. I think we've got quite a good period of time available for this. We've got quite a few questions there. The role of the private sector, trade unions, getting governments more fully engaged and in the discussion and representing the poorest. The issue is not just about the South and developing countries, it's about the world, and how do we actually, if that is the agenda, how do we take that forwards? And then these questions about progress at the coalface and being less than kind of the progress seems to be, in a sense, and the absence of resilience from the current MDGs framework, resilience, vulnerability issues, and so on, and how can we progress that? So, AK, I don't know if you have any observations that you'd like to make on any of this.
Yes, I just wanted to say a few things about the rights-based approach. I think that we are concerned that we don't come to an agreement that, takes away what we have already achieved. And we have invested a lot of time in achieving instruments that enforce rights. So as we move forward, we will be we will be watching what is it that we are agreeing upon, and does it enhance or reduce the rights that we have already achieved. So that's why we feel, certainly from the point of view of disabled people, that where there is an international human rights treaty that many countries have subscribed to, that it should form the basis of whatever we agree post-2015. Somebody mentioned the role of trade unions. I agree with you. In South Africa, the trade union movement, is very, very strong, and they dictate the way government works, and they are able to cause governments to rise or to fall. So, the role of trade unions is very, very important in shaping the politics and the discussions that will take place in the different countries, because at the end of the day, it is the workers that are in the front line of all the objectives that we are looking at. So, yes, I think organized trade unions that are not politically compromised have a role to play in terms of shaping the agenda. The issue of binding agreements versus visionary agreements, my point of view is that we need to look at what other visionary agreements have we gone through, and have they been helpful in causing governments to act in the manner in which that would benefit poor people on the ground. How have we fared? Are we going to do the same all the time, or do we need something that is a little bit more punchy, that governments will be able to respect and governments will be able to hold on to? I would say that a broad framework that is open to interpretation, and we have seen it the way that they are signing up to the UN Convention. Some countries are signing up to some articles and not others, and that freedom of choice, while it is good, but at the end of the day, you compromise what you are trying to achieve, and you compromise so much that at the end of the day, the poor people are the people that are going to suffer. How do we get governments accountable? I think we are still far away, certainly from the point of view of Africa. There are a lot of changes going on now in North Africa, as you know. Citizens taking on responsibility to be a little bit more active in politics. And that is still going on in a number of countries. But I think we have to have governments that are able to look at the electorate and respect the electorate. Because otherwise the only power that you have as a citizen in a country is your power to vote for or against a government that comes to power. Then if you are not able to change government through elections or those political processes, then you are stuck with governments that are there, that pass decisions, that are able to implement protocols, only those that they consider useful for their political cause. So you might have a problem there, and there are a few countries that are in that scenario already. So I would say, yes, we should make governments accountable, and the way to do it is to empower poor people so that they can vote wisely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mukesh.
When Martin Luther King woke up one morning, he didn't say, "I have a nightmare." And he said, "I have a dream." And within a generation, the face of the United States changed, and with it, the rest of the world. No, he didn't sit there. I wonder what would happen if it said, "I have a nightmare," because actually he had a nightmare, really. He just saw the other side. He made it into a dream that changed the world. And he certainly didn't sit there, wherever he was, and said, "Right, I'm now going to have targets for busing and segregation, and I'm going to have indicators by which I'm going to measure this, and then I'm going to set up huge commissions for this," and so on and so forth. And somehow the people, good and bad, and the bad sooner or later came around to being reasonably good, at least good enough for the purposes of change, and the world changed. Now, I think the point I'm trying to make is that it's a false dichotomy between a visionary approach and a kind of more technical targets and so on, even though I'm creating that dichotomy for the point of discussion, you see. But you can't do one without the other. whatever progress one has made in the United States or elsewhere in terms of social inclusion, it has come from a vision. And I come back to that question: what is that particular vision for the future? I think in terms of the politics of the process, which is a critical question, it'll be dictated by, in the same way that all processes are dictated by what happens over the next few years. So what happens on the war on terrorism or its successor, on whichever financial crisis we are in, whichever generation of financial crisis we are in, or which rising power is upsetting who, where, and who is arguing about access to trades and trade and goods and so on. So in other words, I think the real events of the next 3-4 years will actually shape what is finally agreed. So we may make our paradigm development resilient to that by getting it forcefully into people's thinking, so that events of the day don't lead passing events of the day, passing politics of the day, whoever happens to be the president of the United States, whether the person is good or bad, doesn't completely derail what is a long-term good politics we want to bring about. So there will be good politics and bad politics. The question is are there things to do where we can get the good politics for the longer term, take that view, as opposed to be driven by the short-term politics. One aspect of good politics would be to ensure that governments everywhere, rich and poor, are properly educated in their responsibilities in that regard, and see their self-interest. And we see the win-win. And to make the win-win, make people understand the win-win aspects of it, maybe a part of the good, how to bring about good politics as opposed to the bad politics. And that maybe also is an answer, an aspect of the question I think asked online, or asked by someone, governments in developing countries, how to engage them more fully. Well, the best way to engage governments in developing countries is through their people who will elect or diselect them. Being thrown out of office is a great concentrator of the mind, at least in those countries which enjoy reasonable processes of democracy, which by and by are gaining ground. I've got other comments, but I'll stop here now because I'll come back on more. But let me come back to the vision thing again, because I want to really hammer that till the very end. You see, every great change that has taken place has been through a non-binding visionary framework. Look at the United Nations Charter. Look at the original Human Rights Declaration. Look at the international humanitarian law. Look at the refugee conventions and the second order convention. All of those things in their age were incredibly inspirational. I mean, our worry is that if those things were reopened for discussion now, probably we would lack the vision to agree them now. And that's the tragedy of our age, if there is one. So actually, if you look back in history, if you learn from history, and the best guide to the future, incidentally, is the past, as someone has said, it is that actually it's visionary frameworks that have moved the world on, not narrow binding agreements in a way. Narrow binding agreements are important for accountability, but the ultimate accountability, and of course you need the rules and you need laws and regulations, and all that is a good thing, and I'm not at all against all that, but it is not a substitute for that meeting of the minds on shaping the world. And I'm optimistic because, again, if you look at some of the most hopelessly visionary, delusional, idealistic ideas, sooner or later they have come to fruition. That's why the rights approach don't give up. Because as a trade unionist, you know better than anyone else in this room, and also in this country more than anywhere else, how people had to struggle and fight for their rights right from the very beginning. You see, but it happened, and it will happen. So don't compromise with the rights approach or the vision approach, whatever you want to call it. It will happen. Now, a way we might kind of keep faith with this is by not thinking of the successor goals and targets as being time limited in the way we were in the past. We talked about 2015. Why should there be a time scale for the goals? By that, what I mean to say is that you can have targets in countries and so on, and you can have national development plans for 10 years or 5 years. You see, but would it not be better to have a sustainable world system, realizing that it takes time for the world to progress, generations sometimes, and that some kind of decadal ongoing renewal, in a way, would get us into a better track of long-term sustainability, rather than, my God, 3 years' time, MDGs are about to expire, let's shove another 5 billion into malaria or into children's health or something, just simply so that we can meet the targets, which has huge opportunity costs and certainly not as much marginal benefit versus the investments made in. So I think this is also looking at how we shape the overall architecture in addressing the questions that you have raised.
Yeah, I suppose I kind of feel the need to channel Claire Melamed in her absence slightly, and just wonder. I mean, the question she always asks is, how could we design the post-MDG framework in such a way that it actually solves the problem that the MDGs were good at solving? And I think that, I mean, I really hear very strongly what Mukesh was saying about the kind of vision and the leadership and the aspirational aspects, but I'm not sure, and I'd have to think about whether that was what the MDGs were good at solving. It seems to me that they were a slightly different movement in our international diplomacy that had a particular benefit in terms of those perhaps more boring and more restrictive kind of timelines and concrete frameworks, which, and maybe that's not what we want next. But if it's not, then we are talking about something quite different, and there'd be things to lose and things to gain from that. So I'm not sure if I think it needs a bit of thinking through before we go straight to the vision and straight to the big ideas stuff. To address some of the questions in the room quickly, Beverly, on the trade union side, Beyond 2015 are definitely looking to engage trade unions, and in terms of private sector and working conditions goals, my colleague Christina Weller has got a few starter for 10 potential maybe goals for brainstorming that I'm sure she could share with you. In terms of the leadership question from the internet, from the person calling in from online, I think this comes back to the leadership question, really, and I think we're in a bit of a tangle, really, because the UN, as we've discussed, are the only legitimate body that can conceivably lead this process with legitimacy, and they are, for understandable reasons, saying that they don't want to distract from achieving the MDGs in the here and now. How you can get governments in the developing world to start engaging on these questions and taking them very seriously, I think either it has to come from the UN or it has to come from a major groundswell of civil society pressure, which let's hope we can generate. On the final question about national level accountability, we did explore that a little bit with our participants, and there was certainly, I did hear those concerns to an extent about local level, on the coalface and whether you need to disaggregate a little bit further, but I'm not sure if we really got very strong conclusions on it, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. There's going to be another round of questions. Just like to supplement a couple of comments in response to some of the questions raised. On the role of trade unions, I think one of the optimistic things in the scenario is that mainstream trade unions throughout the world are having to deal with, much more now than they used to have to deal with, insecure employment conditions. And those are the conditions that poor people in developing countries have always faced and continue to face. So their interests, I think, are becoming more closely aligned with workers' interests in general. And so the trade unions are having to change the ways that they approach something. And I think that's actually quite an optimistic point. Just on the question that you raised, Paul, about this being a world project rather than a developing country-focused project, I'm disappointed to find that there's very little thinking down that line. Although I think some of what you may have been talking about, Mukesh, is potentially global. You're certainly talking about global common goods and so on. But there are proposals in the atmosphere for Millennium consumption goals, looking at consumption both north and south. in one of the background notes that we produced for an earlier session in this series, looking at climate change and the MDGs, we produced a table looking at what some of those Millennium Consumption Goals might look like. And I mean, that is, you know, marrying the vision with the pragmatic approach. That is one way down that route. But I think it's a very challenging route to go down. But in a sense, that's what you're all saying. Well, some of you are saying, maybe Amy slightly less so.
I'm just not sure.
Yeah, you're not
decided.
sure. I was saying that's what we need, is a much more challenging route. So let's have some more questions. And yes, we'll start there.
We'll start them off.
Hi, I'm Amanda Jackson from Mica Challenge. I was just wanting to follow up Mukesh's point about well-being in his 12 goals, and saying that we could group 4 of them under this idea of individual well-being. And I was wondering what other people on the panel thought of that idea, because it really takes us beyond what we all know is that development is much more than economic goals. And but how on earth can you tantalizingly measure well-being? And you were talking about spiritual and social and those aspects, which are so important and which would take it beyond just raising people out of economic poverty. So I'd be interested to know what other people's comments were.
Okay, let's move all right, we'll go to the electronic audience.
Just
We'll get to you, don't worry.
One quick question from Ros Davies from Women and Children's First. Based on Mukesh's point about governments setting their own priorities and indicators, that could result in some sensitive issues being put to one side, such as sexual and reproductive health. How can the global political leadership deal with this? And Tom Wallace from One just reiterated in a question that was then answered about the importance of vision and difficulty with everyone seeming to have slightly different visions.
Depends on what they consume, I suppose.
Pass it forwards, maybe in this. Then we'll get to the front row, and I won't forget you, don't worry.
My name is Mukat Singh, and I work in India as a voluntary worker in a village, in fact. I'm here on a visit. I'm trying to understand, because I'm working in a village, and here I hear something from Mukesh, who is now in Geneva, working in Geneva. So somebody talking there, and I'm facing the problems in the village and seeing the MDGs from the point of view of my work there. Well, it's very good if some visionary comes, whom we cannot say that somebody will come definitely, but I'm sure the visions will be drawn from the work which has gone on. Mm-hmm. And we have to see what sort of work has been going on, has gone on. So have we learned from whatever work has been done so far? Have we learned enough? And as somebody working in a village, I feel that not enough has been learned. I want your opinion.
Thank you very much. Yes, keep passing it forwards.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Woodside from the International Planned Parenthood Federation, and I have a similar question to Ros Davies, who just called in online. It's about sexual reproductive health, but it's a bigger point. It's about there are a number of frameworks that are coming to fruition around the same time as the MDGs, like ICPD, which is the International Conference on Population and Development, which talks about sustainable development as well as climate change, and also Beijing and women's rights. And I'm just wondering, and this is just a question, because I haven't made up my mind, is whether those other frameworks, and I'm sure there are other frameworks from other development groups that they track, how those get incorporated into the MDGs to make sure that we don't forget them. And I'm still of two minds as to whether we just go with the MDGs and forget the past and move forward. But I don't want to forget our issues. The other thing is just around looking at what the G20 and OECD are really pushing for. Health is dropping off the agenda. It's all about sustainable development, and that worries me coming from a health background. So how do we really ensure that health is there? And I know, Mukesh, you put that in your points, that has to have a place. rights-based, but how do we really ensure that it is? And finally, I'm just making a plea. I liked Andrew's point at the beginning about who's going to lead this process, because it is going to be very messy over the next few years. And I'm just wondering, a lot of donors really look to DFID and see them as sort of quite groundbreaking, especially in Northern Europe. And DFID, well, luckily, hopefully, we'll have a government that doesn't change for the next few years, and on the lead up to 2015. And I'm just wondering if there's any sort of anything DFID can really do in leading the other donors to think about these issues. DFID is, I know we have issues with DFID sometimes, but they're pretty good about civil society participation. I'm just wondering if there's any way that we can almost make a plea to DFID to really sort of help lead that discussion, because I feel it's just going to end up in a big mess. Thank you.
Just pass it along the road. Yeah.
Thank you. Sunit Bagri from Sightsavers. My question picks up on some of the issues around rights and accountability and vision and the technical process. I think philosophically, one can agree that human rights that are recognised in the international human rights instruments and arguably others apply to all. But legally, the situation is a lot more complicated. I mean, ratification is uneven, and even when states have ratified treaties, they often lack accountability when it comes to implementing or not implementing their obligations. I won't go into the noxious terrain of customary law, but it's an equivalent point, really. So the question here is really, how can we ensure a universal framework based on rights, which ironically aren't universally accepted, and even when they are, they're not necessarily properly implemented or in a way that's accountable at least? Thanks.
Okay, and I'd just like to, yes, pass it along the row if you would. I'd just like to add to that. I mean, we've, in the Chronic Poverty Research Centre, we've looked at the application of rights-based frameworks. And although, the rhetoric and so on is very clear, the laws are often very clear, there is very little evaluation of what happens when you try to apply rights-based legislation. So it's one of the areas, as you were mentioning, where I think we really don't know enough about what actually happens. What difference does it make in that village if you have this piece or that piece of legislation or that constitutional provision, or the government has signed up to that particular treaty? I mean, there's a lot still to learn there. Yes, please.
Hi, my name's Kohinoor Chowdhury. I'm from Child Reach International, and I guess I want to comment. It's not really a question; it's a comment about this discussion, and also about the well-being question that the lady over there mentioned, and also about Mukesh's question about the definition of development. And in my opinion, the definition of development, it's, yes, well-being might be, everything is leading up to well-being, but these targets, these goals that we're thinking of, shouldn't really incorporate well-being, in my opinion, because if you ask the villagers, they won't say, we want more money for, I don't know, a temple or something to do with their spirituality. They will... We're talking about, well, sorry, that's what I think. And when I speak to the villagers, that's what they tell me. But they will say that we have limited resources. That's what the MDGs are about. We have to talk about a small pot of money that needs to be shared, and then the villagers need to talk about where they want that money to go. And I totally agree with Mr. Dubé about the rights-based approach and the Human Rights Treaty. You're absolutely right. It's all been agreed, but it's not being implemented. And as the MDGs have been so successful today, we need to start now using that momentum for human rights and benefiting people who have been excluded from the current MDGs. So as Mukesh mentioned about the street children have been excluded from benefiting from universal primary education goals, from the health goals, because they're excluded. Same with disabled people, same with children living in orphanages, children separated from their parents. We need to start looking at excluded, marginalised people who can't benefit from the mainstream. And that's my comment.
Okay, thank you very much. And behind you?
Hi, Chris Thade from DFID, but not providing any institutional leadership on this issue at the moment. A couple of comments. I mean, I have to say I found Mukesh's discussion kind of, in some ways, profoundly depressing and leaves me worse off than I came into the room with. I think the thing is, the vision that gave rise to the MDGs was incredibly powerful, and it resonates to the extent that we have a consensus in favour of overseas development in this country that has survived across parties, despite the worst economic crisis in the last 60 or 70 years. It doesn't seem to me there's anything wrong with that vision. The focus on the MDGs, if anything, got in the way because we started to think of them as ends in themselves rather than as the route map they were supposed to be, and a kind of accountability framework that was readily comprehensible, which one could mobilize attention around. And I think if you start worrying about the MDGs of the vision, of course you get into trouble, but that's not what they were ever intended to be. So the question I would like kind of answered is not, you know, do we need a new vision or how do we create this? I think we have a powerful vision that we, if anything, need to resuscitate. But the thing is, how does that vision resonate in a world that's profoundly different, in the way that the G20 is now a completely different leadership group and architecture for debate than it was before? We've had social movements, too early to say whether they will succeed or not, in North Africa that have potentially changed a lot of the voices that are coming out there. And so I think while Mukesh decried some of the process-driven stuff at the beginning, it seems to me that actually that discussion, that the introductory presentation is important, not because it replaces a vision, that vision needs to be brought out, but because it recognizes that we're actually in a different world to the world in 1995, and we need to find different ways of engaging with those other players, some of which have vibrant civil societies and some of which don't.
Okay, let's take one last question and then we'll go back to the speakers for some final comments. Nobody wants a last question. Is there anything from online? Okay, then we can go straight back to the speakers. If some of them questions were addressed specifically to you, if you can try and make sure we don't miss those.
Right. I will deal with the issue of the village and
Very good.
The rights issue. I think, yes, we need to understand how the village works. What is prioritized in the village? Is it infrastructure that comes to the village? Is it schools? Are there things? What are the voices from the villages saying? And those voices, I agree, they very often they are not heard at all. And the voices that are heard are the voices of government. As you say, government is the legitimate authority and all that goes with it. But the voices of villagers are hardly heard, and that is where the problem is. So if we listen to the villagers, then I think we will hear a lot about what are the issues and how to deal with them. Concerning the rights-based approach and legislation that flows from it and whether it is implemented or not. Yes, I agree with you totally. It's very disappointing. The implementation of legislation or any measures that are put in constitutions has been very, very low. It hasn't been progressing as well as we wanted it to be, except in Uganda, where they have a small sentence which says there will be persons with disability in every country, in every county in the country. And as a result, they have 46,000 persons with disabilities, one man, one woman, in every county in Uganda that is representing the needs of persons with disabilities. So there again, but however, don't ask me whether the representation is effective or not. That's another issue. So I think that, yes, you are quite right. In many cases, legislation and policies, they remain trapped on paper and they are not implemented. And the way to deal with that is to look at the problem holistically, and you will find that within government, there are civil servants that are supposed to be driving this agenda. And in most cases, it's at that level that policy evaporates. And it never goes down to benefit the people that it is meant to benefit. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, where to start? And how long have you got? Now, a couple of minutes. Well, I'm not sure. Well, firstly, I think let me start again with the visions, and not to be misunderstood. I'm not decrying the Millennium Development Goals. I played a small, modest role in it myself while I was in DFID at that particular time. And our poor brains and our limited thinking of that day and our limited intelligence and inspiration of that time gave us the MDGs. So there we are, and they have done well. I really hope, that in 20 whatever we are now, we are wanting to rise up from that, not to simply set our standards at the levels that prevailed 20 years ago, which has been the most changeful decades of the last century and this one so far. Apart from the negative sides of terrorism and 9/11 and all that, the positive sides of a world on the move, developing countries are rising in their aspirations, the internet liberating people as never before, you see, and so on and so forth. I think it is time for a vision, and for a new vision. If the vision of the MDGs was that of trying to create a global fund, which was to basically shove more money by donors into addressing fundamental issues of human security and survival, and that was the vision of development, and if this is what we do in our future vision, then I certainly don't want any part of it. A few weeks ago, in this great city, there was a great meeting on the replenishment of Gavi, and it was highly successful, chaired by the British Prime Minister, and I was very proud to see my country taking such a role despite the depressing state it's in. Now, and the billions were raised for it. And then I remember on an overseas travel to one of the countries I go to, someone saying to me, it was in Africa actually, saying to me, he felt really ashamed that he and his government could not look after the basic human dignities of their child's survival, that they had to go to a foreign club, to a foreign city, a foreign land, beg for money for malaria, for measles. We haven't got a vaccine for malaria yet, but it'll come, for measles and all the rest of it. Now, what kind of vision is this? The future of the world is not about relying on more and more aid, which is minuscule important. DFID, generous as it is, the best as it is, I'm very proud of having been part of it. I'm very proud that the tradition of aid remains strong in Britain, and DFID remains a leader in this particular area. But this is not the future. This is absolutely not the future. If a future development vision is equated with aid giving and more aid giving, whether it's from the north to the south, or whether it's from the new rich middle-income countries to the poorer countries, or even within, that's not the vision of development that we really are talking about. So yes, we need a definite change of vision in that, you see. And underpinning all this is this question of leadership. Let me come back to it, because I mentioned it and other people came about it. And somebody, in a somewhat sort of wistful manner said, could DFID provide leadership? Well, fantastic. I mean, I very much hope DFID will provide leadership, and everyone. But having worked in both British government and in the United Nations and in goodness knows how many multilateral organizations, and now in the International Federation of the Red Cross, etc., I have seen good leadership and bad leadership. The worst thing we can do is to mortgage the future of our planet on a single set of leaderships, whether it is in one set of institutions like the UN, or whether it is in one set of powerful countries, or whether it is in one category of people. We've been there. The world has trusted to leadership, and when they elevated certain leaderships, and then the leadership has fallen flat on its face, we've had to carry the cost. So leadership, yes, but leadership is not a substitute for people of all denominations, institutions of all shapes and sizes, countries of big and large, small and big, taking leadership, collective leadership, and that comes from within. And the conditions for, if you like, to create this better world or this better vision is if we can allow this leadership to happen. If, on the other hand, we are plaintively looking to New York and meetings and summits and all the rest of it, and G20 to somehow send tablets down from the latest summit, then we will get what we probably deserve, if you like. That's not the sort of leadership that we are talking about. It's not to say that these institutions are not important or the politics is not important, but we're not helpless victims on this some kind of somebody coming to tell us, give us leadership, great leaders, and then tell us what visions you are having, and then we will have a new development. So what I'm talking here about is actually more fundamental issues where we must combine our leadership, we must learn from the practices on the ground from the villages. By the way, let me say that the world no longer lives in villages, unfortunately. More than half the population now lives in cities, and the dynamic and the economics of the urban cities is very different from the villages. It's not to say villages aren't important. I take it as a metaphor, what you say, and it applies to urban areas as well. But it's a completely different world out there. Let me stop there.
Okay, thank you. Before coming to Amy, there's just a couple of issues which people have raised, which I think are quite important, which none of us on the panel have quite yet addressed. One is everybody, it seems, has agreed that national governments and national civil societies need to play much more of a role in this future that we're looking at than in the past in some cases. But what does that do to these quite critical issues, and sexual and reproductive health was mentioned, which may be very sensitive and difficult and challenging in particular contexts? I think this is a really important question. It's slightly tangential, but I think nevertheless it's important. And the other one was about the different visions that obviously there are, and what do you do about that? How do you strategize with that? Amy, do you want to take either of those?
I was going to take something else, actually.
You're going to take something else. Can I just go back to either AK or Mukesh on those?
Well, I think the reproductive health and the whole set of issues around population, for example, and reproductive choice really are extremely important. They're not tangential; they're actually central in a way.
And which DFID isn't afraid to address.
Indeed, absolutely. And I think the point is they must have visibility in any framework. There is no question about that. And I don't think it's a question of writing goals in a way, in a mousy way, so that you people, certain words, if you like, are taboo. It's a question of where it comes in, really. So, for example, in a proposed architecture, it comes in a number of different headings. There's a whole goal on gender equality. There's a whole goal on good health for best possible physical and mental well-being. Though reproductive choice is not just health, really. It's much broader than that. But I think the real kind of value, the real concreteness of this will be more at the level of national targets and indicators. And while I'm at it, this question about what about those countries who are not going to, that if you set aside sensitive issues, they will not be followed up. If you let countries set their own targets, then they will get an alibi for not doing things that they don't like doing, if you like, you see. Well, I should have mentioned earlier, in this kind of proposed architecture, there is also something about minimal global norms and standards. In other words, a set of standards and norms which all countries, regardless where you are, should achieve. And then there are, if you like, additional achievements which you may do in your own context, what you can afford, what you have, and so on and so forth, you see. And in all this, let us remember this universality point made earlier on. People are signed up to universal human rights and then they don't follow it. Well, actually, though it's always the aspirations and the norms always lag far ahead of what happens. But without them, there is no road, there is no direction of travel. And all the experience again indicates is that some of those norms which were appeared impossible to achieve 20 years ago, 10 years ago, have been achieved in the last 10 years. Even some of the facile debates on human rights actually have got a meaning to them as they unfold in places like Geneva and elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Amy.
Okay, I'll just rattle through a few of the questions from the floor. Amanda, well-being, good idea? Yes, absolutely. It was something that we covered in CAFOD's human flourishing research very, very much, which I hope would also speak something to the kind of grand vision idea that Mukesh has been talking about. Jennifer, in terms of the health dropping off the agenda question, I mean, it's not my kind of area of expertise, but just to sort of contextualise, you might have seen Alex Evans's blog a couple of weeks ago, which was explaining why there were 3 MDG goals related to health and only 1 for many of the other sectors, and that was because of the 3 UN agencies which they were trying to sort of dollop out. So, I hope if there was only 1 goal for health or a lesser number of goals, that wouldn't be misread as a deprioritisation. It would more be a sort of sensible, not directing them towards the institutional frameworks. That's just a little bit of context. Yeah. On the leadership question, one name that's been coming up quite often in the several conversations I've been having with numerous groups over the last few months is could that come from Lula, and in which case would Rio +20 be a key moment whereby Lula might be prepared to give some inspiration and some dynamism behind this process. So Lula, if you're watching, do get in touch.
And there's a copy of that report here for
you can have one of these. It's your incentive.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering those. I'm sorry if your question didn't quite get answered in the way that you wanted. I think we've run out of time and we should stop the session now. It's been a very rich conversation. Thank you very much to our speakers. Maybe we can just give them a special round of applause. And thank you to you for putting perceptive issues on the floor. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the conversation, but I will just say that Claire will watch